There's a stretch of road in Texas where too many never made it home. For over 50 years, they've vanished, one by one.
Daughters, sisters, friends, gone without a trace.
All along a single highway, Interstate 45.
4 women, 1 field, no answers.
One of them was Laura Miller. Her story would change everything.
Her mother's search exposed a nightmare deeper than anyone imagined.
2 names emerged. But how many more still lurked in the dark?
Decades turned to dust, yet the secrets of I-45 refused to surface.
This is the story of the missing and the highway that won't forget.
Interstate 45 stretches through the heart of Texas, a road built for connection. But over decades, it became a silent witness to disappearances, neglect, and lives that never reached their destination. Running from Dallas to the Gulf Coast, Interstate 45 is more than asphalt and exits. It is a corridor of movement, commerce, and constant motion. Millions of vehicles pass along it each year, commuters driving to work, families heading toward the coast, long-haul trucks crossing counties, cities, and jurisdictions in a matter of hours. On the surface, it is ordinary, functional, forgettable. But between Houston and Galveston, this stretch of highway accumulated a history that could not be seen from the road itself, a history written in missing persons reports, unidentified remains, and decades of unanswered questions. From the 1970s through the early 2000s, women began disappearing along this corridor. Some were young, some were older, some were traveling, some lived nearby. Some were last seen hitchhiking, others vanished after nights out, short drives, or routine errands. Their lives did not intersect, their backgrounds did not match, their destinations varied. What bound them together was geography, the same highway, the same surrounding industrial zones, the same remote spaces hidden just beyond exit ramps and frontage roads. At first, no one called it a pattern. Each disappearance arrived in isolation, handled by separate police departments across different counties at different times. One missing person report did not resemble the next. Some cases were classified as runaways, others were quietly deprioritized. Many involved women whose lives placed them on the margins, women whose absence did not generate immediate pressure, sustained media attention, or urgent interagency coordination. The road continued to carry traffic. The disappearances continued quietly beside it. Over time, the names accumulated. Case files stacked up in filing cabinets. Families waited. And beneath the noise of everyday travel, Interstate 45 absorbed a darker reputation, not as a single crime scene, but as a corridor where crimes could occur without immediate consequence, where bodies could be hidden in undeveloped land, where predators could move freely across jurisdictional boundaries, where disappearances could be explained away, delayed, or forgotten. This documentary examines the series of disappearances and murders collectively known as the missing persons of the I-45 corridor, not as a single mystery with a simple solution, but as a convergence of violence, systemic failure, and opportunity. It is not the story of one killer. It is not the story of one investigation. It is the story of how a highway became an environment where multiple offenders could operate, where warning signs were missed, and where accountability arrived too late for many. The I-45 corridor between Houston and Galveston occupies a unique position in Texas geography. It connects a major metropolitan center to a port city, passing through petrochemical plants, warehouses, refineries, undeveloped tracts of land, and rapidly expanding suburbs. During the late 20th century, this region was defined by growth and sprawl, new roads carved through old land, industrial areas isolated from residential neighborhoods, and stretches of darkness separating pockets of light. These conditions did not cause violence, but they shaped how violence could be concealed. For women traveling alone, especially during the 1970s and 1980s, this corridor presented risks that were not yet fully understood or publicly acknowledged. Hitchhiking was still common. Public awareness around serial violence was limited. Communication between law enforcement agencies was slow and inconsistent. A person could disappear in one jurisdiction and be found or not found in another, with no immediate mechanism to connect the two events. Time became the greatest ally of whoever was responsible. As the years passed, bodies were discovered in fields and wooded areas near the highway. Some were identified quickly, others remained Jane Does for decades. Some were eventually linked to known offenders, others could not be conclusively tied to anyone. The discoveries did not provide clarity, they raised new questions. How many victims had been missed? How many cases had been misclassified? How many killers had used the same roads, the same exits, the same blind spots? The idea that Interstate 45 was associated with multiple violent crimes did not emerge all at once. It surfaced gradually, through fragments. A body found near League City, a missing woman last seen near a truck stop, remains located miles from where a person was reported missing. Investigators began to recognize overlaps not in victim profiles but in locations. The highway itself became the common denominator. This realization came slowly, hindered by the structure of law enforcement itself. City police departments focused on city limits, county sheriffs focused on unincorporated areas, state agencies operated with different mandates. No single entity owned the full picture. What appeared to be isolated incidents were in reality pieces of a much larger puzzle spread across decades and jurisdictions. Families experienced this fragmentation firsthand. Parents, siblings, and children navigated bureaucratic barriers while searching for answers. Some were told there was no evidence of a crime. Others were advised to wait. Some were left to conduct their own searches, distribute flyers, and pressure authorities to keep cases open. The absence of coordination compounded the trauma of loss, turning grief into a long-term struggle for recognition and accountability. The I-45 corridor did not become notorious overnight. It earned its reputation through accumulation of missing women, of unidentified remains, of investigative gaps. As like a single crime scene frozen in time, this was an evolving landscape where violence intersected with infrastructure, a place where crimes did not need to be hidden deep in wilderness, they only needed to be placed just far enough from view. Understanding this story requires rejecting the idea of coincidence without embracing sensational explanations. It requires examining how geography, social vulnerability, and institutional limitations aligned over decades. It requires acknowledging that multiple offenders exploited the same environment, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes years apart. And it requires confronting the uncomfortable reality that many warning signs were visible long before the full scope of the violence was understood. This documentary does not seek to assign blame retroactively or to create fear around a stretch of road used daily by millions. It seeks to document what happened, how it happened, and why it was allowed to continue for so long. It seeks to center the victims, not as statistics or symbols, but as individuals whose lives were interrupted by circumstances larger than any single case file. The central question is not whether Interstate 45 was cursed or inherently dangerous. Roads do not kill, people do. The question is whether the structure surrounding this corridor, physical, social, and institutional, created conditions where violence could repeat itself without immediate detection. Whether silence, fragmentation, and dismissal allowed a highway to become something it was never meant to be. As this story unfolds, names will emerge. So will timelines, evidence, and failures. Some answers exist, many do not. What remains constant is the weight of absence, the knowledge that dozens of women set out along this road and never came home. Interstate 45 continues to function as intended. Cars move, commerce flows. The past is invisible to most who pass through, but beneath the surface, the corridor carries memory of lives lost, of families waiting, and of a truth that took decades to come into focus. This is the story of how a highway became a silent witness, and how for too long, no one was listening.
Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston is not defined by distance alone. It is defined by transitions, from dense urban neighborhoods to industrial expanses, from residential streets to frontage roads, from illuminated interchanges to stretches of near-total darkness. These transitions matter. Over decades, they shaped how people moved, where they stopped, and where someone could vanish without immediate notice. Leaving Houston southbound, the highway passes through a mosaic of environments. There are commercial districts and densely populated neighborhoods, followed by refinery complexes, shipping corridors, and clusters of warehouses set back from the road. The exits arrive quickly and often. Each one opens into a web of service roads, access lanes, and secondary highways that spread outward and reconnect in unpredictable ways. For someone unfamiliar with the area, it is easy to become disoriented within minutes of leaving the main lanes. The frontage road system is central to understanding the corridor. Designed for convenience, it allows vehicles to exit and re-enter the highway repeatedly without traveling far. In practice, it creates parallel routes where traffic is sparse, visibility is limited, and surveillance is minimal. A vehicle can pull over without drawing attention. Another can follow without being noticed. Movement between jurisdictions becomes seamless, while accountability does not. Industrial zones line large portions of the route. These areas operate on shift schedules that change daily and nightly. At certain hours, they are crowded with workers and vehicles. At others, they are nearly empty. The rhythm is inconsistent. Security varies. Some properties are fenced and monitored. Others are open fields interrupted by dirt roads and drainage ditches. These spaces create pockets of isolation within a metropolitan region, places that are not meant for lingering but are rarely watched closely. Beyond the industrial areas, undeveloped land stretches outward. In the late 20th century, much of this land remained sparsely populated. Construction lagged behind expansion. Roads were built before neighborhoods followed. Fields, wooded tracts, and retention ponds sat just beyond the reach of streetlights. These spaces were not wilderness, but they were neglected, close enough to be accessible, far enough to be overlooked. Truck stops and rest areas dotted the corridor, especially during the 1970s and 1980s. These locations functioned as temporary communities, with people coming and going at all hours. They were designed to accommodate long-haul travel, not to monitor interactions. For someone seeking anonymity, they offered it. For someone vulnerable, traveling alone, hitchhiking, or between destinations, they offered exposure. Hitchhiking along highways was not uncommon during this period. Public messaging about serial offenders was limited. Women traveling short distances often relied on rides, assuming familiarity with the area reduced risk. The I-45 corridor, with its steady flow of traffic and frequent exits, appeared safer than isolated backroads. In reality, it provided the opposite: opportunity without witnesses. Jurisdictional boundaries intersect the corridor repeatedly. City limits blur into county lines. Authority shifts without visible markers. A disappearance reported in one area might involve a last known location in another. Evidence discovered miles away could fall under a different agency altogether. Before the digital age, sharing information required time, paperwork, and coordination that was not always prioritized. Delays became routine. This fragmentation mattered. It meant that patterns tied to location rather than victim profile were harder to see. A body found near the highway might be cataloged locally without being cross-referenced against missing persons reports from neighboring jurisdictions. A traffic stop, a witness sighting, or a suspicious vehicle might never be connected to a case outside the reporting officer's area. The highway enabled movement faster than information could follow. Environmental features further complicated searches. Drainage systems ran beneath and alongside the road, designed to manage flooding in low-lying coastal terrain. These channels extended into fields and wooded areas, creating narrow corridors of concealment. Seasonal flooding altered landscapes, redistributing debris and obscuring evidence. What was visible one month could be buried the next. Lighting conditions varied sharply. Interchanges were brightly illuminated. Adjacent stretches were not. The contrast created zones where activity could be concealed just beyond the reach of visibility. Sound from traffic masked other noises. A vehicle stopping briefly would not register as unusual. The constant motion of the highway normalized behavior that might appear suspicious elsewhere. The corridor also reflected broader social dynamics. Many victims later connected to cases along I-45 were women navigating economic instability, transitional housing, or unstable employment. This is not a commentary on personal choices. It is a recognition of structural vulnerability. When people must move frequently, rely on others for transportation, or work irregular hours, their routines become less visible to others. Their absence is harder to detect quickly. Law enforcement resources were unevenly distributed along the route. Urban centers had more personnel but higher caseloads. Outlying areas had fewer officers covering larger territories. Industrial zones fell into gaps where no single agency maintained consistent presence. These disparities shaped response times and investigative depth. Some disappearances triggered immediate action, others did not. The physical design of the highway encouraged speed and transience. Vehicles entered and exited constantly. Drivers did not linger. Witnesses were fleeting. Surveillance cameras were rare or non-existent during much of the period in question. Even when witnesses existed, their observations were often limited to moments, a car, a person, a direction of travel, without context or follow-up. As development increased in later decades, some of these spaces changed. Land was built upon, roads were widened, lighting improved. But the crimes under examination occurred during a time when the corridor was defined by its in-between nature, not rural enough to be empty, not urban enough to be observed. It was precisely this ambiguity that made it exploitable. Understanding the geography of the I-45 corridor is essential to understanding why the disappearances were possible and why they persisted. The road did not create offenders, it created opportunity. It offered access without oversight, movement without traceability, and concealment without distance. This environment did not operate in isolation from human decision-making. It interacted with social assumptions, institutional limitations, and technological constraints. Together, these factors produced a setting where crimes could occur repeatedly without immediate recognition of a broader pattern. By the time connections began to emerge, the corridor had already accumulated years of history. Missing persons reports filed away, remains unidentified, families waiting. Geography does not explain motive, but it explains method. It explains how multiple offenders, operating independently or years apart, could find the same spaces useful. The highway was not merely a backdrop, it was an active participant in the story, shaping movement, dictating response, and hiding what passed too close to see. Before any names are spoken, before any cases are examined, the corridor itself must be understood, because without that understanding, what follows appears random. It was not random. It was enabled.
The earliest disappearances connected to the I-45 corridor did not announce themselves as the beginning of anything larger. They arrived quietly, one by one, folded into the daily workload of police departments already stretched thin. In the 1970s and early 1980s, missing persons cases were rarely treated as emergencies unless there was immediate evidence of violence. Absence alone was not enough. Along the stretch between Houston and Galveston, that assumption would prove costly. Many of the women who vanished during this period were last seen doing ordinary things. Some were traveling short distances. Some were heading to work. Others were moving between temporary living situations. Their routines were not identical, but they shared a common vulnerability. They were visible only briefly, and then not at all. When they did not return, there were often delays before reports were filed. Friends assumed they had moved on. Employers assumed they had quit. Families were told to wait. In the 1970s, hitchhiking remained common in Texas, especially along major highways. Economic necessity, limited public transportation, and cultural norms all played a role. Young women traveling alone often accepted rides without the expectation of danger, particularly along routes that felt familiar and busy. Interstate 45, with its constant traffic and proximity to populated areas, did not fit the image of a place where people disappeared permanently. Early cases were fragmented by circumstance. One woman might be reported missing in Harris County, another in Galveston County. A third might have last been seen near a truck stop but lived elsewhere entirely. Each report entered a separate system. Each was evaluated independently.
There was no mechanism to recognize that these disappearances shared geography rather than personal history. Some of the earliest known victims vanished after being seen near the highway or its service roads. Others were last known to be traveling in vehicles that were never recovered. In several cases, there was no clear last sighting at all, only a point where contact ceased. These gaps made investigation difficult and allowed assumptions to fill the void: runaway, voluntary disappearance, lifestyle choice. Each label reduced urgency. Law enforcement practices at the time reflected broader societal attitudes. Women who lived outside traditional family structures were often considered transient by default. Those working irregular jobs or moving between addresses were treated as unreliable reporters of their own lives. If no immediate crime scene existed, cases stalled quickly. Evidence was not preserved because there was nothing officially to preserve. When remains were discovered in later years, some would eventually be traced back to this early period. At the time, however, bodies found near the corridor were not automatically linked to missing persons cases along it. Identification relied on fingerprints, dental records, or personal effects, resources that were often incomplete or unavailable. Many victims became Jane Does not because they were unknown, but because the systems needed to name them were not connected. The first disappearances did not follow a clean pattern of age, appearance, or background. Some women were teenagers, others were adults. Some were employed steadily, others were between jobs. This diversity obscured connections. Investigators looking for a serial offender expected similarity. What they found instead was variety, and variety suggested coincidence. Media coverage was inconsistent. A disappearance might receive brief local attention and then fade. Without a body, there was no sustained narrative. Without public pressure, departments prioritized cases with clearer leads. Over time, files were archived. Detectives retired or transferred. Institutional memory eroded. Families, meanwhile, experienced the slow realization that official interest was limited. Many conducted their own searches, posting notices, contacting hospitals, shelters, and morgues. Some families traveled repeatedly along the corridor, retracing possible routes. Others relied on word of mouth. Their efforts were isolated, mirroring the isolation of the cases themselves. By the early 1980s, a small but troubling number of women connected to the I-45 area had vanished without explanation. There was no official acknowledgement of a trend, no task force, no centralized database. Each case remained bounded by its original report, even as similarities quietly accumulated. In hindsight, certain warning signs were present. Several disappearances occurred near highway-adjacent locations, rest stops, service roads, industrial zones. Some women were last seen accepting rides or traveling without confirmed transportation. Others vanished during short, routine trips that should not have resulted in extended absence. These details would later take on significance. At the time, they were treated as circumstantial. The absence of immediate violence played a crucial role. Without signs of struggle, investigators had little leverage to escalate cases. Technology offered no assistance. There were no cell phone records to analyze, no GPS data to retrace movements, no digital footprints to reconstruct timelines. Once a person stepped off the grid, they were effectively gone. As years passed, additional disappearances occurred under similar conditions. Still, they were not connected. The corridor continued to function as a space of movement, not memory. The idea that a major highway could be associated with serial violence had not yet entered public consciousness. That would change, but only after remains began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored.
The first phase of the I-45 story is defined less by what was known than by what was dismissed. These early cases failed because evidence contradicted a pattern. They failed because no one was looking for one. The women who vanished during this period did so quietly, their absences absorbed into the background noise of a growing region. By the time investigators would later revisit these disappearances, decades had passed. Witnesses had moved or died. Landscapes had changed. Records were incomplete. What remained were names, dates, and unanswered questions, the foundation of a story that would only become visible after it was already too large to contain. The first disappearances were not recognized as the beginning of a corridor-wide crisis. They were treated as individual tragedies. That distinction between isolated loss and collective failure would define everything that followed.
For years, investigators searching for connections among the disappearances along the I-45 corridor were guided by an assumption that ultimately worked against them, that a pattern, if it existed, would be visible in the victims themselves: age, appearance, background, lifestyle, criminal history, employment, family structure. These were the variables traditionally used to identify serial crime. Along Interstate 45, those variables were fused to align. The women who vanished between the 1970s and the early 2000s did not resemble one another in ways that law enforcement had been trained to recognize as meaningful. Some were teenagers, just beginning adulthood. Others were women in their 20s and 30s. A few were older. Some were mothers. Some were not. Some lived with family. Others lived alone, with friends, or moved frequently. Their lives did not intersect socially, professionally, or personally. They did not attend the same schools, work the same jobs, or share the same neighborhoods. This lack of similarity created a false sense of separation. Each case appeared to stand alone, defined by its own circumstances and its own unanswered questions. When investigators compared files, the differences were more obvious than the overlaps. As a result, the possibility that these women were connected by a shared environment rather than shared identity remained largely unexplored. The disappearances occurred at different times of day and under different conditions. Some women vanished at night, others during daylight hours. Some were last seen walking. Others were traveling by vehicle or attempting to secure transportation. In a few cases, the last confirmed contact was a phone call or a brief sighting that offered no sense of danger. The absence of a consistent scenario further reinforced the belief that no single explanation could account for all the cases. At the time, this reasoning felt sound. Serial crimes, as understood in late 20th century policing, were expected to follow recognizable scripts. Investigators were taught to look for repetition in victim selection and method. When those elements were missing, the assumption was that coincidence, not connection, was responsible. What was overlooked was the role of place. When analysts decades later began mapping these cases geographically, a different picture emerged. The victims did not share demographics, but they shared proximity. Again and again, their last known movements intersected with the same stretch of Interstate 45, particularly the portion between Houston and Galveston. Exits repeated, service roads repeated, surrounding areas repeated. What had once seemed scattered became concentrated. This shift from profiling people to analyzing environment was critical. It revealed that the pattern was not who the victims were, but where they were vulnerable. The corridor itself functioned as a common thread, connecting individuals who otherwise had nothing in common. This realization challenged deeply ingrained investigative habits. Geography had often been treated as a backdrop rather than evidence, a place where events happened, not a factor that shaped them. Along I-45, geography was not passive. It actively enabled movement, concealment, and repetition. The corridor offered access to multiple jurisdictions within minutes. A person could encounter a victim in one city, commit a crime in another,
and dispose of evidence in a third. Each step could fall under different authority. This fragmentation meant that even when similarities existed, they were divided across agencies that rarely compared notes in real time. The victims' differences also influenced how their cases were prioritized. Some disappearances received immediate attention, others did not. Women who lacked stable housing, regular employment, or strong institutional advocates were more likely to have their cases delayed or deprioritized. This was not always the result of malice. It was often the result of limited resources and ingrained assumptions about risk and responsibility. But the effect was the same. Delays cost time. Time cost evidence. Media coverage reflected these disparities. Some cases were briefly reported and then disappeared from public view. Others received minimal attention from the outset. Without a consistent narrative, there was no sustained pressure on law enforcement to look beyond individual circumstances. The absence of a visible pattern allowed the story to fade repeatedly, only to resurface when another woman vanished or remains were discovered. As the years passed, bodies were found in areas adjacent to the highway. Fields, wooded tracts, undeveloped land near industrial zones. Some victims were identified quickly, others remained nameless for years or decades. These discoveries forced a reevaluation of earlier assumptions. A disappearance once believed voluntary was now understood as homicide. A case once considered isolated now demanded comparison. Still, connections were difficult to establish. Multiple offenders operated along the corridor at different times. Their methods were not identical. Some victims were killed shortly after abduction. Others appeared to have been held for unknown periods. Disposal sites varied. These differences fractured the emerging pattern, making it appear inconsistent even when geography remained constant. This multiplicity was one of the most complicating factors. Investigators searching for a single perpetrator encountered contradictions. Evidence that fit one case did not fit another. Timelines overlapped imperfectly. The presence of more than one offender using the same corridor meant that the pattern was not linear, it was layered. In this environment, the victim's diversity became a liability rather than a safeguard. Instead of preventing stereotyping, it prevented recognition. The lack of a single victim profile delayed acknowledgement that something systemic was happening. It allowed the corridor to continue functioning as a space where violence could recur without immediate alarm. Families felt the consequences of this delay acutely. Many were told there was no evidence their loved one had been harmed. Some were advised to wait before filing reports. Others encountered subtle skepticism. These responses did not reflect the reality that later emerged, but they shaped the trajectory of each case. Early assumptions hardened into long-term barriers. As cold case units later reviewed the files collectively, the pattern became undeniable. The victims were different, but the circumstances of their disappearances were not. The same types of locations appeared repeatedly, the same lack of witnesses, the same jurisdictional complications, the same absence of early evidence due to delayed response. This reframing had profound implications. It demonstrated that serial violence does not always depend on victim similarity. It can depend on opportunity, on access, on infrastructure. The I-45 corridor provided all three. It offered a predictable flow of potential victims, an easy means of escape, and a landscape capable of hiding crimes in plain sight. The lesson was not abstract, it was painfully concrete. By focusing too narrowly on who the victims were, investigators missed what connected them. By the time the environment itself was recognized as evidence, much of that evidence had been lost. Development erased open land. Construction altered access points. Witnesses' memories faded. Records deteriorated. The opportunity to intervene earlier, to recognize the corridor as a recurring factor, had passed. The victims without a pattern were never truly without one. The pattern simply existed where few were looking, along a highway designed to connect cities, but which instead connected disappearances across decades.
Interstate 45 did not choose its victims. It shaped the conditions under which they could be taken. And for too long, that distinction remained unseen.
The failures that allowed disappearances along the I-45 corridor to continue were not the result of a single mistake or a single department. They were the product of structural blind spots, gaps built into how law enforcement understood jurisdiction, risk, and responsibility during the decades when these crimes occurred. These blind spots did not appear dramatic in isolation. Taken together, they created conditions where violence could repeat itself without early detection. The most significant limitation was jurisdictional fragmentation. The stretch of Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston passes through multiple cities, counties, and unincorporated areas in a relatively short distance. Each segment is governed by a different authority, each operating under its own priorities, procedures, and resource constraints. When a disappearance crossed those invisible boundaries, continuity fractured. A missing person report was typically handled by the agency where it was filed, not where the person was last seen, and not where they might ultimately be found. Investigators focused inward, examining family dynamics, personal relationships, and immediate surroundings. This approach was logical within traditional policing models, but it failed to account for the reality of highway-based crime, where movement is rapid and locations are transient. When evidence surfaced outside the original reporting jurisdiction, responsibility became ambiguous. A body found in a field near the highway might fall under county authority, even if the victim lived and vanished in a city miles away. Coordination required deliberate effort, formal requests, and time. In many cases, it did not happen quickly, if at all. This fragmentation was intensified by technological limitations. During the 1970s and 1980s, records were maintained locally and on paper. There were no centralized digital databases capable of cross-referencing missing persons reports across counties or decades. Detectives could not search region-wide patterns with a few keystrokes. Connections depended on memory, chance, or informal communication. As a result, similarities that might have been obvious in aggregate remained invisible in isolation. A detective handling one disappearance had no efficient way to know whether a similar case had occurred 20 miles away 5 years earlier under another department's jurisdiction. Even when suspicions arose, there was no formal mechanism to pursue them collectively. Case classification created another critical blind spot. Adult women who disappeared without immediate signs of violence were often categorized as voluntary absences during the early stages of investigation. This classification carried significant consequences. It reduced urgency. It delayed searches. It limited resource allocation. It discouraged escalation to state or federal agencies. The concept of the runaway, applied broadly during this era, was especially damaging. Women who lived independently, moved frequently, or lacked stable housing were often assumed capable of leaving by choice. This assumption persisted even when families insisted that the disappearance was out of character. Each day that passed without reclassification reduced the likelihood of recovery. Law enforcement culture at the time also placed heavy emphasis on solvability. Departments facing high caseloads prioritized crimes with witnesses, crime scenes, or immediate suspects. A missing person with no clear evidence of foul play offered little investigatory traction. As new cases arrived, older ones receded. Files were archived. Momentum was lost. Resource disparities along the corridor compounded these problems. Urban departments were overwhelmed by volume. Rural or semi-industrial areas were understaffed, with officers covering vast territories. Industrial zones near the highway often fell into patrol gaps, areas that belonged to everyone and no one. These spaces became spaces where crimes could occur with minimal risk of interruption. Training limitations further constrained recognition. Investigators were taught to identify serial crime through repetition of victim profile and method. When neither appeared consistent, the possibility of a shared environmental factor was not prioritized. The highway itself was not considered a suspect.
Geography was treated as background, not evidence. When remains were discovered near the corridor, the same blind spots re-emerged. Identification relied on dental records, fingerprints, or missing persons matches, which all depended on accurate, accessible records. In cases where missing persons reports had been delayed, misclassified, or filed under different names or jurisdictions, identification became difficult or impossible. Unidentified victims were sometimes buried without definitive linkage to missing persons cases elsewhere. Even when remains were preserved, follow-up depended on future advances that were not yet available. Each unidentified body represented not just a lost life, but a lost investigatory opportunity. Time eroded accountability. As years passed, detectives retired or transferred. New investigators inherited files with limited context. Early assumptions hardened into institutional truth. A case labeled as voluntary absence remained so unless actively challenged. Reopening required justification that was often difficult to produce decades later. Public pressure, when present, influenced outcomes unevenly. Families with media access or advocacy support were sometimes able to keep cases alive. Others were not. This disparity created an investigatory landscape shaped as much by visibility as by evidence. Perhaps the most consequential blind spot was the absence of a mandate to examine the corridor as a whole. No agency was tasked with asking whether the highway itself was a recurring factor. Without that responsibility, no one owned the pattern. The question went unasked not because it was unimportant, but because it fell outside established frameworks. These blind spots were not unique to Texas. They reflected national policing practices of the time. But along I-45, their impact was magnified. The highway enabled rapid movement across jurisdictions faster than information could travel. Offenders exploited that imbalance. Law enforcement struggled to adapt. By the time interagency cooperation improved and task forces became more common, much of the damage was irreversible. Evidence had degraded, landscapes had changed, witnesses were gone. What remained were fragments, and the realization that earlier intervention might have altered outcomes. The failures along the I-45 corridor were cumulative. No single decision caused them. Instead, a system designed for isolated incidents was confronted with a problem that required regional vision, and it responded too slowly. The corridor did not create violence. It revealed the cost of blind spots.
For years, the disappearances along the I-45 corridor were discussed as a collective problem without a clear human shape. The absence of a visible pattern delayed recognition not only of connections between cases, but of perpetrators themselves. It was only when investigators began to examine solved crimes alongside unsolved disappearances that a difficult truth emerged. The corridor was not the domain of a single offender. It was a shared environment exploited by multiple violent individuals over time. This realization fundamentally altered how the cases were understood. Early assumptions had leaned toward either coincidence or the possibility of one elusive killer. Neither explanation fit the full scope of evidence. The timeline was too long, the methods too varied, the victim's circumstances too inconsistent. What investigators slowly recognized was that Interstate 45 functioned as a recurring opportunity zone, a place where different offenders, operating independently and sometimes years apart, found similar advantages. The emergence of known offenders linked to areas along the corridor did not immediately clarify unsolved cases. Instead, it complicated them. When arrests were made and convictions secured in certain murders, attention shifted toward determining whether those individuals were responsible for more than the crimes for which they were charged. In some instances, links could be established through evidence. In others, suspicion remained without confirmation. This ambiguity mattered. It meant that the presence of a known offender did not automatically resolve other cases in the same geographic area. Investigators were forced to confront the possibility that multiple predators had used the same spaces,
fields, service roads, industrial tracts, without ever intersecting with one another. The corridor did not belong to one killer. It was a resource. As law enforcement began to re-examine cold cases with this perspective, patterns emerged not in behavior, but in timing and access. Some offenders were active during specific periods, leaving clusters of crimes that later went dormant. Others appeared briefly, committed a limited number of known offenses, and disappeared from records entirely. The corridor's long history allowed these activities to overlap without immediate detection. The discovery of human remains near the highway played a crucial role in shifting understanding. Bodies found years apart in similar locations suggested repeated use of certain areas for disposal, yet forensic evidence often could not establish whether the same individual was responsible. Decomposition, environmental exposure, and the passage of time limited conclusions. In many cases, all that could be said with certainty was that the corridor had been used again. Investigators also had to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some offenders were not identified at all. While a few individuals were eventually arrested and convicted for murders connected to areas near I-45, many disappearances could not be conclusively tied to them. This left open the likelihood that other perpetrators operated without ever being named, their crimes hidden among unsolved cases. The existence of multiple offenders undermined early investigative strategies. Searching for a single suspect led to dead ends. When one offender was apprehended, there was an expectation, sometimes public, sometimes internal, that closure would follow. Instead, questions multiplied. Which cases belonged to whom? Which did not belong to anyone already known? This complexity also affected families. Each arrest raised hopes that answers were coming, only to leave many still waiting. For some, a loved one's disappearance remained unresolved, even as others received confirmation of what had happened. The uneven distribution of closure deepened the emotional toll. From an investigative standpoint, the corridor began to be understood less as a crime series and more as a crime ecosystem. Certain features made it repeatedly attractive: easy access from multiple directions, proximity to large populations, and the availability of secluded disposal sites within minutes of major roadways. These features did not change over time, even as offenders did. Law enforcement agencies faced a challenge in communicating this reality. Public narratives often favor simplicity: one killer, one motive, one story. The truth along I-45 resisted that structure. Explaining that multiple offenders exploited the same geography required acknowledging systemic vulnerability rather than individual anomaly. The recognition of multiple offenders also forced a reassessment of earlier conclusions. Cases once dismissed as unrelated began to be reconsidered, not because they matched a specific offender's profile, but because they occurred within the same enabling environment. The absence of a single perpetrator no longer argued against connection. It argued for a broader lens. This shift was gradual and uneven. Some investigators embraced it. Others remained cautious, wary of over-connecting cases without definitive evidence. That caution was justified, but it also meant that progress was slow. Each case required independent verification. Each potential link demanded proof that was often unavailable. The corridor's history further complicated matters. Crimes committed in the 1970s occurred under vastly different investigative conditions than those in the 1990s or early 2000s. Advances in forensic science created uneven evidence quality across decades. Some cases benefited from DNA analysis. Others relied solely on circumstantial information. Comparing them required careful calibration. The emergence of serial offenders along I-45 did not bring clarity so much as context. It demonstrated that the disappearances were not the product of chance alone. They occurred because individuals recognized and exploited a system that allowed movement without scrutiny and disposal without immediate discovery. This understanding reframed the corridor as a shared vulnerability rather than a mystery waiting for a single solution.
It highlighted the need for regional analysis, long-term data integration, and sustained attention beyond individual cases. It also underscored how easily violence can persist when opportunity remains constant. By the time this perspective gained traction, many offenders were dead, incarcerated for unrelated crimes, or beyond the reach of accountability. The window for accountability had narrowed. What remained was the task of distinguishing what could be proven from what could only be suspected, and doing so without erasing the victims whose cases resisted resolution. The emergence of serial offenders did not end the story of the I-45 corridor. It expanded it. It revealed that the true danger was not a single presence, but a pattern of exploitation made possible by geography, silence, and delay. The highway had not hidden one killer. It had accommodated many. And that realization would soon collide with a discovery that forced the scale of the violence into undeniable view.
The realization that Interstate 45 had been used repeatedly as a corridor for violent crime remained abstract until a specific place forced the scale of that violence into focus. That place lay southeast of Houston, near the city of League City, a stretch of undeveloped land not far from the highway, bordered by industrial growth on one side and quiet neighborhoods on the other. For years, it appeared unremarkable. Then, human remains were found, and then more. The discovery did not occur all at once. It unfolded over time, beginning with isolated findings that initially appeared unconnected. Remains were located in wooded areas and fields close to the highway, places that were accessible yet rarely traversed on foot. The land was close enough to Interstate 45 to be reached within minutes, yet far enough from regular traffic to avoid casual discovery. It was not wilderness, it was neglected space. As additional remains were uncovered, investigators were forced to confront a disturbing possibility. This was not a single crime scene, it was a repeated disposal area. The land near League City had been used multiple times over multiple years by more than one offender. The term killing fields emerged not as a formal designation, but as a grim shorthand for what the evidence suggested, a place where violence had been returned to again and again. The geographic characteristics of the area were central to its use. The land sat near multiple exits off Interstate 45, allowing vehicles to enter and leave without drawing attention. Industrial activity nearby created irregular traffic patterns. At certain hours, the area was nearly deserted. At others, movement blended into background noise. The terrain itself, uneven, wooded, and partially obscured, concealed remains from view. Early discoveries were often limited by the condition of the remains. Environmental exposure, time, and animal activity complicated identification and forensic analysis. In several cases, investigators could not determine cause of death with certainty. What they could determine was that the bodies did not belong there by accident. These were not natural deaths. They were not the result of isolated incidents. They were deliberate. As more remains were found, the pattern became harder to ignore. The same general area continued to produce evidence. This forced law enforcement agencies to reassess earlier assumptions. What had been treated as isolated discoveries now demanded collective analysis. The land itself became evidence, a fixed point linking crimes that otherwise resisted connection. The discovery of the killing fields intensified scrutiny of unsolved missing persons cases along the I-45 corridor. Investigators began comparing timelines, last known locations, and physical descriptions. In some cases, remains could be matched to women who had disappeared years earlier. In others, identification proved impossible. The gap between disappearance and discovery had erased too much. For families, the discoveries brought a painful mix of hope and dread. The possibility of answers existed alongside the fear of confirmation. Some families learned the fate of loved ones after years of uncertainty. Others waited through each new search, knowing that remains were being found, but not knowing whether any would be identified as someone they loved.
The killing fields also exposed the limitations of earlier investigations. Had the area been searched more thoroughly in the past, some remains might have been found sooner. But without a reason to suspect a repeated disposal site, the land had not been prioritized. It fell between jurisdictions, like so much else along the corridor. No single agency had reason to claim ownership of it until the evidence forced their hand. The discovery prompted renewed collaboration among local, county, and state authorities. Searches became more systematic, technology improved, cadaver dogs were deployed. Yet even these efforts faced constraints. Development pressures threatened to alter the landscape. Construction loomed. Each delay risked losing what remained. Investigators were careful in how they interpreted the findings. The presence of multiple bodies in the same general area did not automatically mean they were all placed there by the same person. The emerging understanding of the corridor suggested otherwise. This land had been used because it was useful, accessible, concealed, and overlooked. Different offenders could have independently recognized its value. This nuance was critical. It prevented the narrative from collapsing into a single killer explanation that the evidence could not support. It also complicated the path to accountability. If multiple offenders had used the same site, distinguishing their crimes required precision that time had eroded. The killing fields did, however, confirm something essential. The violence associated with Interstate 45 was not hypothetical. It was real, physical, and concentrated. Bodies had been placed there intentionally. The disappearances were not merely administrative failures. They were the result of lethal acts. The discoveries also reframed the corridor in the public consciousness. What had been an abstract series of missing persons reports became tangible. The land near League City transformed from anonymous space into a symbol of cumulative neglect. It represented the cost of delayed recognition, of treating cases separately when they demanded collective urgency. For law enforcement, the killing fields served as both evidence and indictment. Evidence of crimes that had gone undetected, indictment of systems that had allowed those crimes to accumulate. The focus shifted from whether the corridor was dangerous to how long that danger had been underestimated. Even as remains were recovered, the work was incomplete. Many victims remained unidentified, others never found. The killing fields were not the entirety of the corridor's violence, they were a visible fragment. What lay beyond them, along other exits and other tracts of land, remained unknown. The discovery near League City marked a turning point in the story of Interstate 45. It forced recognition of scale. It confirmed that the corridor had functioned as more than a route of travel. It had become a repository for unresolved violence. What followed would involve attempts to name the victims, assign responsibility, and reckon with what could no longer be undone. But the killing fields ensured that the story could not be dismissed again. The land had spoken, and what it revealed demanded answers that would prove difficult to obtain.
The discovery of remains near the I-45 corridor transformed disappearance into confirmation for some families, but it also deepened uncertainty for many others. Each recovery answered one question while opening several more. Who was found? Who was not? Who could be identified? Who would remain nameless? Along this highway, resolution was never evenly distributed. For a small number of cases, forensic evidence allowed investigators to connect remains to missing persons reports. Dental records matched. Personal effects were recognized. In later years, DNA analysis provided confirmation that had once been impossible. These identifications closed chapters that had been open for decades. Families finally learned what had happened, even if that knowledge arrived far too late. But closure did not always bring peace. For many families, confirmation of death ended hope while reopening grief. The years spent searching did not soften the reality of loss. Instead, they amplified it. Parents who had imagined reunions were forced to imagine final moments. Siblings who had grown up without answers now had to reconcile memory with evidence. Identification was not an end.
It was a transition from uncertainty to mourning. Other families never reached that point. For every victim identified, others remained missing, their fates unknown, their names absent from official conclusions. The corridor produced both answers and silence, often simultaneously. Searches uncovered remains that could not be linked to anyone. Advances in forensic science outpaced the quality of old records. Time continued to work against clarity. Unidentified remains posed a particular challenge. Many bodies discovered near the corridor were badly decomposed by the time they were found. Environmental exposure erased distinguishing features, clothing deteriorated, personal items were lost or displaced. Without fingerprints or dental records on file, identification depended on comparison to missing persons reports that might never have been properly filed or preserved. In some cases, missing persons reports existed but lacked critical details. Descriptions were vague, photographs were outdated or missing, records were misfiled or archived under incorrect jurisdictions. These gaps meant that even when remains were recovered, matching them to a specific individual was not guaranteed. The unevenness of resolution created a stark divide among families. Some were contacted by investigators with updates, evidence, and explanations. Others heard nothing at all. They watched news coverage of discoveries near the highway, knowing that someone had been found, but not knowing whether it was their loved one. Each announcement brought renewed anxiety. The passage of time compounded these effects. Families aged, parents died without answers, children grew up without knowing what happened to siblings or mothers. The search for truth became intergenerational. Responsibility shifted from those who first reported disappearances to those who inherited the unanswered questions. Law enforcement faced its own challenges in navigating this landscape. Confirmed identifications required careful communication. Unconfirmed cases required restraint. Investigators could not offer certainty where none existed. They were forced to balance transparency with the limitations of evidence. In doing so, they often confronted frustration from families who had waited years for even partial information. The distinction between victims found and victims still missing also shaped public understanding of the corridor. Identified cases became narratives with names and timelines. Unidentified victims remained abstract, their stories reduced to statistics. This imbalance risked erasing those who could not be named, even as their absence remained just as real. Efforts to identify unknown victims intensified in later years. Advances in DNA technology offered new possibilities. Genealogical databases allowed comparisons that had once been impossible. Cold case units revisited remains that had been stored for decades. In some instances, these efforts succeeded. In others, they revealed how much had been lost. Even when identification became possible, it did not always lead to prosecution. In cases where offenders were dead, incarcerated for unrelated crimes, or unknown entirely, naming the victim did not mean naming the person responsible. Justice, like closure, remained partial. The corridor's history ensured that some families received answers while others did not because their loved ones mattered less, but because circumstances, timing, and documentation varied. This unevenness became one of the defining characteristics of the I-45 story. Resolution was not a shared experience, it was a fragmented one. For families still waiting, the absence of remains meant the absence of finality. Without confirmation of death, hope persisted alongside pain. Some continued to search actively. Others waited for contact that never came. The possibility that a loved one might still be alive coexisted with the fear that they were not. This limbo carried its own psychological toll. The existence of multiple offenders further complicated matters. Even when remains were found, determining which cases belonged together required caution. Investigators could not assume that proximity meant connection.
Each identification raised new questions about how many victims remained undiscovered and how many disappearances had never been linked to the corridor at all. The victims still missing represent the limits of investigation. They are the cases where evidence never surfaced, where remains were never recovered, or where identification proved impossible. Their absence highlights how much of the corridor's history remains unresolved. This imbalance between the found and the missing underscores a central truth. Discovery does not equal resolution. Recovery does not erase loss. Identification does not guarantee justice. Along I-45, answers arrived unevenly, shaped by chance as much as effort. As forensic science advanced, hope resurfaced for some families. Databases expanded, techniques improved. Yet even these advances could not overcome every obstacle. Some cases lacked usable DNA. Others had no surviving relatives for comparison. Time continued to impose limits. The story of the I-45 corridor is therefore not just about what was uncovered, but about what remains absent. It is about the lives that could be named and those that could not, about families who buried loved ones and families who still wait. The victims found anchor the story in fact. The victims still missing remind us of its incompleteness. Together, they define the emotional and investigative weight of the corridor, a place where answers arrived too late for many and never arrived at all for others. And as long as names remain missing, the story cannot truly end.
By the time the scale of violence along the I-45 corridor became undeniable, one reality overshadowed every renewed effort. Much of what might have led to answers was already gone. Evidence had been missed, mishandled, or lost. Opportunities to intervene had passed unnoticed. The corridor's history was not only a record of crimes committed, but of chances that slipped away, one decision at a time. In the earliest years, many disappearances did not generate crime scenes. A woman did not return home. A phone call went unanswered. A routine trip stretched into days. Without visible signs of violence, investigators had little to preserve. No taped-off locations, no collected fibers, no documented vehicle sightings. What could not be seen was not secured, and what was not secured could not be revisited later. This absence of early evidence shaped everything that followed. When a case is treated as a voluntary disappearance, investigative actions are limited. Search areas are smaller. Time-sensitive leads are not pursued aggressively. Surveillance footage, if it existed at all, was rarely collected quickly enough to matter. Witness memories faded before they were ever recorded. In several cases, witnesses later came forward describing sightings or encounters that had seemed insignificant at the time. A woman seen near a service road, a vehicle stopped briefly near an industrial tract, a conversation at a truck stop. These details, offered months or years later, were impossible to verify. Without contemporaneous documentation, they became fragments without context. Physical evidence suffered similar fates. Items recovered near the corridor were sometimes stored without clear association to specific cases. Labeling practices varied by department and era. As personnel changed and storage systems evolved, continuity broke down. An object collected in one decade might be rediscovered later without clear provenance, its relevance uncertain. When remains were found years after a disappearance, investigators faced the compounded effects of time. Environmental exposure degraded forensic markers, clothing deteriorated, soil conditions altered bone structure, insects and animals erased indicators that might once have suggested cause of death or time of deposition. What remained was often enough to confirm homicide, but not enough to reconstruct events. The loss was not limited to physical evidence. Institutional memory faded as well. Detectives who had handled early cases retired, transferred, or died. Their insights, suspicions, and informal observations were rarely captured in official records. New investigators inherited files stripped of nuance,
forced to rely on written summaries that reflected early assumptions rather than later understanding. Technology gaps widened the divide between past and present. DNA analysis, now central to cold case work, was unavailable or limited during much of the I-45 active period. Biological samples, if collected at all, were not always preserved in ways that would later allow testing. In some cases, evidence that could have yielded DNA was discarded because its future value was not yet understood. Even when DNA became available, matching it to individuals proved difficult. Many victims came from backgrounds where medical or dental records were incomplete. Some had never been fingerprinted. Others had families who moved, changed names, or died before genetic comparison became possible. The chain linking victim to evidence to perpetrator was often broken at multiple points. Jurisdictional fragmentation compounded evidence loss. Items collected by one agency were not always shared with others. A piece of information considered irrelevant locally might have been crucial in a broader context. Without centralized oversight, these fragments remained isolated, their significance unrealized. There were also missed chances rooted in assumptions. Early classifications of disappearances as voluntary or non-criminal delayed escalation. Leads that contradicted those assumptions were sometimes dismissed. A pattern that did not fit existing frameworks was harder to recognize, and so it was often ignored. In hindsight, certain moments stand out as potential turning points. A cluster of disappearances near the same exits, multiple remains found within a limited geographic area. Reports that, if combined earlier, might have suggested coordinated response. None of these moments were obvious in real time. Together, they illustrate how incremental oversights accumulate into systemic failure. Law enforcement agencies later acknowledged some of these shortcomings openly. Cold case reviews identified gaps in documentation, inconsistencies in evidence handling, and missed opportunities for interagency cooperation. These acknowledgments didn't assign blame to individuals. They recognized structural limitations that shaped outcomes. For families, the knowledge of lost evidence added another layer of grief. The idea that answers might once have been possible but were no longer attainable carried its own weight. Some families learned that items connected to their loved ones had been misplaced or destroyed. Others were told that key witnesses could no longer be located. Each revelation narrowed the path forward. The passage of time also altered landscapes. Fields where remains had been found were developed. Industrial zones expanded. Roads were widened. Places that might once have held undiscovered evidence were paved over or repurposed. Searches conducted decades later could not recreate the conditions of the past. Media attention, when it arrived late, brought its own complications. Public tips flooded in long after memories had faded. Investigators had to sort credible information from speculation. Without contemporaneous corroboration, many tips led nowhere. The volume of information increased, but its reliability diminished. The corridor's history demonstrates a harsh truth of criminal investigation. Time is not neutral. It erodes evidence, distorts memory, and narrows options. Each delay, each assumption, each unshared report accelerated that erosion. Despite renewed efforts, some cases reached a point where no further progress was possible. Evidence was insufficient for prosecution. Suspects could not be identified or were already dead. The legal threshold for action could not be met. These conclusions were not declarations of closure. They were acknowledgments of limits. The missed chances along the I-45 corridor were not dramatic failures captioned in headlines. They were quiet ones. A report not escalated, a file not shared, a lead not pursued. Individually, they seemed reasonable. Collectively, they were devastating. The story of lost evidence is inseparable from the story of the victims. It explains why so many cases remain unresolved despite decades of effort. It underscores why recognition came late, and justice, in many instances, never arrived. What remains is the responsibility to learn from these failures, not as abstract lessons, but as concrete reminders of what happens when systems cannot see beyond their own boundaries. Along Interstate 45, the cost of missed chances was measured not only in unanswered questions, but in lives that might have been saved had those chances been recognized sooner.
While investigations stalled, files were archived, and evidence deteriorated, the families of those who vanished along the I-45 corridor did not stop searching. Their efforts unfolded outside official timelines and beyond institutional constraints. For many, the search became a permanent condition of life, a parallel existence shaped by absence, persistence, and the refusal to accept silence as an answer. In the early days after a disappearance, families followed predictable paths. They contacted friends, employers, hospitals, and shelters. They retraced routes. They drove along the highway and its service roads, stopping at places where their loved one had last been seen. These actions were driven not by strategy, but by urgency. Each hour felt critical, even when authorities advised patience. As days turned into weeks, families encountered the limits of official response. Some were told there was no evidence of a crime. Others were advised that adults had the right to disappear. These statements, though procedurally accurate, carried emotional consequences. They shifted responsibility onto those already grieving. Families were left to justify concern rather than receive support. Many began creating their own systems of search. They printed flyers, distributed photographs, and posted notices in public spaces. They returned repeatedly to the same locations, hoping visibility might produce information. Some contacted media outlets directly, seeking coverage that law enforcement could not provide. Others organized small networks of volunteers, often composed of friends and extended family. The absence of centralized information meant families often learned about developments indirectly. A news report about remains found near the highway, a rumor circulating through the community, a brief mention of a cold case review. Each piece of information reignited hope and fear simultaneously. Families waited for phone calls that might never come. Over time, the search changed form. Immediate action gave way to long-term vigilance. Families kept files, saved correspondence, and documented interactions with authorities. Some became experts in their own cases, tracking dates, locations, and names of investigators. This accumulation of knowledge was not a choice, it was a necessity born of uncertainty. The emotional toll was cumulative. Living without answers meant living without closure. Celebrations were shadowed by absence. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays became reminders of what was missing. Parents aged while waiting. Children grew up without knowing what had happened to siblings or parents. Grief did not resolve, it lingered. For some families, identification of remains brought a measure of certainty. For others, it brought renewed anguish. The confirmation of death ended hope, but did not erase questions. How did it happen? When? Why? Who was responsible? In cases where no prosecution followed, families were left with knowledge but not justice. Families whose loved ones were never found faced a different burden. Without remains, there was no finality. Hope persisted alongside despair. Some continued searching actively. Others maintained readiness, keeping contact information current in case authorities reached out. The possibility of discovery remained ever present. Advocacy emerged organically from this landscape. Some families began pushing for policy changes, improved missing persons protocols, and greater interagency cooperation. They attended meetings, wrote letters, and spoke publicly about their experiences. Their voices highlighted systemic gaps that individual cases could not. In certain instances, families connected with one another, forming informal networks bound by shared experience rather than shared loss. These connections provided validation and support. They also revealed patterns that had not been acknowledged officially. Stories overlapped, locations repeated, timelines intersected. Families recognized connections long before institutions did. The persistence of families played a crucial role in keeping cases alive. Media attention, when it returned years later, often did so because families refused to let stories fade. Cold case units were sometimes prompted by sustained advocacy.
DNA testing initiatives gained momentum through public pressure. Progress, when it occurred, was frequently the result of collective insistence rather than institutional initiative. The cost of this persistence was high. Searching required time, money, and emotional energy. Some families exhausted savings traveling to follow leads or attend hearings. Others faced strain in relationships and employment. The search became a defining feature of identity, shaping life decisions long after the initial disappearance. Interactions with law enforcement evolved over time. Initial frustration sometimes gave way to cautious collaboration. In other cases, mistrust deepened. Families navigated these relationships carefully, aware that cooperation was necessary but not guaranteed. They learned to advocate without alienating those who controlled access to information. Generational shifts added complexity. Parents who began searches in the 1970s and 1980s were sometimes gone by the time new investigative tools became available. Responsibility passed to siblings, children, or extended family. The search outlived those who initiated it, becoming an inherited mission. Public understanding of the I-45 corridor was shaped as much by families as by investigators. Their stories humanized abstract statistics. They put faces to numbers. They reminded audiences that each case represented a life interrupted and a network of people left behind. The family's refusal to stop searching did not guarantee results. Many never received answers, but their persistence ensured that the corridor's history could not be erased. It forced recognition that disappearance is not a moment, but a process that continues long after official attention fades. In the absence of closure, families created their own forms of remembrance. Memorials, anniversaries, and rituals acknowledged lives without definitive endings. These acts did not resolve uncertainty, but they asserted presence in the face of absence. The story of the I-45 corridor cannot be told without acknowledging these families. They carried the weight of loss, while institutions struggled to adapt. They maintained memory when systems failed to preserve it. Their search became a counterpoint to silence. As investigations moved into new phases, driven by advances in technology and renewed attention, families remained central. They provided DNA samples. They revisited old files. They answered questions repeatedly. Their endurance sustained the possibility of progress. The families who never stopped searching did more than seek answers. They exposed the human cost of delay and fragmentation. They transformed private grief into public accountability. And they ensured that the victims of the I-45 corridor were never reduced to forgotten names in archived files. Their search continues, not because it is easy, but because stopping would mean accepting a silence they have refused for decades.
By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the story of the I-45 corridor had entered a new phase, not because the crimes were recent, but because the tools to revisit them finally existed. After decades of fragmentation, delay, and lost opportunity, advances in forensic science began offering something that had long been missing: the possibility of connection without witnesses, memory, or confession. Renewed investigations did not begin with optimism. They began with realism. Law enforcement agencies understood that time had eroded much of what traditional investigation relied upon. Witnesses were gone. Landscapes were altered. Suspects had aged, died, or disappeared into prison systems for unrelated crimes. What remained were fragments, physical, biological, and documentary, that could only be useful if technology could extract meaning from them. DNA analysis became the central tool in this effort. Biological material recovered from remains, clothing, or personal effects was re-examined using methods unavailable at the time of collection. Samples that once yielded nothing were tested again. In some cases, material previously thought unusable produced viable genetic profiles. This shift alone reopened possibilities that had been closed for decades. However, DNA did not offer instant solutions. Many samples were degraded beyond recovery. Others lacked comparison points. A genetic profile is only as useful as the database it can be compared against. Early DNA databases focused on convicted offenders, limiting their relevance to cases where suspects were already known.
For many victims along the I-45 corridor, no such suspects existed. The expansion of genetic genealogy changed that equation. By comparing DNA from unidentified remains to public genealogy databases, investigators could identify distant relatives and reconstruct family trees. This approach did not require prior criminal records. It relied instead on shared ancestry. Slowly, methodically, names began to emerge where none had existed. These breakthroughs were not limited to identifying perpetrators. They were equally important in identifying victims. For families who had waited decades without confirmation, genetic genealogy offered answers that traditional records never could. In several cases across Texas, long unidentified remains were finally named, allowing families to reclaim loved ones from anonymity. Cold case task forces played a crucial role in applying these tools. Unlike earlier investigations constrained by jurisdiction, these units were designed to operate collaboratively. They reviewed cases collectively, looking for overlap rather than difference. Files from multiple decades and agencies were brought together. Patterns were reassessed with fresh perspective. The formation of these task forces represented an institutional shift. Instead of treating cases as isolated failures, agencies acknowledged systemic limitations and attempted to address them through cooperation. This did not erase past mistakes, but it reduced the likelihood of repeating them. Technology also transformed data management. Digitization allowed old reports to be searched and cross-referenced in ways previously impossible. Mapping software enabled geographic analysis across time, revealing clusters that had once gone unnoticed. Timelines could be layered, movements reconstructed. The corridor itself could be analyzed as a continuous environment rather than a series of disconnected points. Despite these advances, progress remained uneven. For every case reopened, others remained stagnant. DNA testing is expensive and time-consuming. Not all jurisdictions had equal access to resources. Decisions had to be made about which cases to prioritize. These decisions, though necessary, carried ethical weight. Choosing one case meant delaying another. Families were again drawn into the process. Many were asked to provide DNA samples decades after their loved ones disappeared. These requests reopened wounds. They also offered hope. Participation was voluntary, but for many families it felt like the only remaining path forward. Communication improved, but not uniformly. Some families received regular updates, others heard little. The balance between transparency and caution remained delicate. Investigators could not promise outcomes, they could only promise effort. Modern forensic techniques also raised new challenges. Genetic genealogy relies on public databases populated by individuals who may not be aware their data could be used in criminal investigations. Ethical guidelines evolved alongside technology. Agencies developed protocols to limit scope, protect privacy, and ensure responsible use. These considerations slowed implementation, but strengthened legitimacy. Even when identifications were made, accountability was not guaranteed. In some cases, perpetrators were already deceased. In others, evidence was insufficient for prosecution despite identification. The legal system requires standards that science cannot satisfy. Families sometimes learned who was responsible without seeing charges filed. Closure remained partial. The renewed investigations highlighted a sobering reality. Technology can illuminate the past, but it cannot undo it. DNA can name a victim, but it cannot return lost years. Genealogy can identify a suspect, but it cannot recover evidence destroyed by time. Progress came with limits. Still, these efforts marked a turning point. They demonstrated that the story of the I-45 corridor was not frozen in the past, it was evolving. Each identification challenged the idea that disappearance meant erasure. Each reopened file asserted that time alone does not determine relevance. The renewed focus also influenced policy. Missing persons protocols were reevaluated. Interagency databases expanded. Training emphasized early evidence preservation and geographic analysis. These changes were not retroactive, but they reflected lessons learned from the corridor's history. Public awareness grew as well.
High-profile cases solved through genetic genealogy captured attention and shifted expectations. Families previously told nothing could be done were encouraged to re-engage. Hope returned cautiously, tempered by decades of disappointment. The renewed investigations did not resolve every case connected to Interstate 45. They were never going to. What they did was redefine possibility. They replaced resignation with persistence. They acknowledged that while justice delayed is not justice denied, delay carries irreversible costs. For the victims of the corridor, modern forensics arrived too late to save lives. For some families, it arrived just in time to provide answers, and for others, it remains a promise still unfulfilled. As technology continues to advance, the corridor's unresolved cases remain under watch, not as relics, but as responsibilities. The renewed investigations proved that silence was not the final chapter, but they also made clear that progress, when it comes, often arrives long after the damage is done. The road forward would require not only better tools, but a willingness to confront what the corridor revealed about failure, vulnerability, and delay. And that reckoning extended far beyond the laboratory.
The story of the I-45 corridor is not only a record of individual crimes, it is a reflection of how violence can take root where systems fail to see the full picture. Over decades, this stretch of highway came to represent something far larger than the sum of its cases. It exposed how infrastructure, social vulnerability, and institutional blind spots can intersect in ways that quietly enable harm. At its core, the corridor represents mobility without accountability. Highways are designed to move people efficiently across space. They compress distance, erase boundaries, and prioritize speed. In doing so, they also reduce friction, not just for commuters and commerce, but for those who intend to exploit anonymity. Along I-45, movement was easy, observation was not. This imbalance mattered. The corridor also represents how violence against vulnerable women has historically been deprioritized. Many of the victims connected to I-45 lived lives that placed them outside traditional centers of attention. Some faced economic instability, some lacked consistent housing, some worked irregular hours or relied on informal transportation. These conditions did not cause their victimization, but they shaped how their disappearances were interpreted. When a person exists at the margins of visibility, their absence is easier to rationalize. When routines are not tightly observed by others, disruption is slower to detect. The I-45 cases revealed how quickly concern can be softened by assumption and how deadly that softening can be. The corridor also represents fragmentation. Law enforcement agencies operated within defined jurisdictions, each responding to what appeared to be isolated incidents. The highway ignored those boundaries. Offenders did too. This mismatch allowed patterns to remain hidden in plain sight. No single agency had responsibility for the whole. No single database told the entire story. This fragmentation was not unique to Texas. It reflected a national structure in which local autonomy often outweighs regional coordination. Along I-45, the cost of that structure became visible over time. The absence of early data sharing delayed recognition. Delayed recognition allowed repetition. The corridor further represents the danger of over-reliance on victim profiling. Investigators searched for similarity in people rather than in places. When that similarity did not exist, connection was dismissed. The I-45 cases demonstrated that serial violence does not always conform to demographic expectations. Opportunity can be as decisive as preference. This lesson has implications beyond this highway. It challenges assumptions about how patterns form and how they should be detected. It suggests that environment, roads, access points, neglected land must be treated as active elements in violent crime, not neutral settings. The I-45 corridor also represents time, specifically how time compounds harm when response is delayed. Each unrecognized disappearance made the next easier. Each lost lead reduced future options. Time eroded evidence, memory, and accountability.
By the time recognition arrived, the opportunity to prevent further harm had passed. For families, time was not abstract, it was lived daily. Years without answers reshaped identities and futures. The corridor stands as a reminder that investigative delay carries human cost far beyond case statistics. On a broader level, the corridor represents how modern landscapes can conceal repeated violence without dramatic warning. There were no obvious danger signs, no sudden spike that demanded immediate action. The crimes accumulated slowly, blending into the background of growth and movement. This gradualism made them easier to ignore. The highway also symbolizes how silence operates, not just the silence of victims who could not speak, but the silence created by missed communication, dismissed concerns, and assumptions left unchallenged. Silence was not malicious, it was procedural, it was systemic, and it was effective in allowing harm to continue. The I-45 corridor further represents the limits of retrospective justice. Advances in forensic science and renewed investigations provided answers for some families, but not for all. Technology arrived unevenly, accountability was partial. The corridor reminds us that solutions applied late can never fully repair what delay has damaged. At the same time, it represents resilience. Families refused to let stories disappear. Advocates pushed for change. Investigators revisited old files. Progress, when it came, was hard-won. The corridor's history includes not only failure, but persistence. It also represents a warning about how infrastructure shapes risk. Highways, industrial zones, and undeveloped land are not inherently dangerous, but they create conditions that can be exploited if oversight is absent. Urban planning, policing, and social services intersect more than they are often acknowledged. The I-45 cases demonstrate what happens when those intersections are ignored. The corridor stands as a case study in why early intervention matters. Small decisions, whether to escalate a case, share information, preserve evidence, have long-term consequences. The cumulative effect of inaction can rival the impact of deliberate wrongdoing. Importantly, the I-45 corridor should not be understood as an anomaly. It is an example. Similar patterns have emerged along other highways, transit routes, and transient spaces across the country. What makes I-45 distinct is that its history has been documented long enough to reveal the pattern. The corridor represents the gap between how systems are designed and how harm actually occurs. Systems respond best to clear events. Harm along I-45 unfolded gradually, diffusely, and across boundaries. That mismatch delayed response. Ultimately, the I-45 corridor represents responsibility. Not fear, not inevitability. Responsibility to recognize vulnerability early. Responsibility to coordinate across lines drawn on maps. Responsibility to treat absence as urgency, not inconvenience. It is a reminder that infrastructure carries memory, even when people do not. Roads remember where bodies were left, where searches failed, where silence prevailed. Whether that memory leads to change depends on what is done with it. The corridor does not demand sensationalism, it demands reflection. It demands acknowledgement of what allowed violence to persist and commitment to preventing those conditions from recurring. What happened along Interstate 45 cannot be undone, but what it represents can inform how similar risks are addressed elsewhere. The value of this story lies not only in remembering victims, but in recognizing the structures that failed them. And that recognition is only meaningful if it leads to responsibility, shared, sustained, and acted upon.
By the time investigators, families, and the public began to understand the scope of violence connected to the I-45 corridor, the question was no longer whether crimes had occurred. That was undeniable. The question became narrower and more painful. What exactly had been solved, and what never would be? Some cases connected to the corridor reached formal resolution. In these instances, investigators were able to identify perpetrators, establish responsibility through evidence, and secure convictions. These outcomes mattered. They affirmed that the system could work, even belatedly.
They provided families with answers grounded in fact rather than speculation. They created official records that acknowledged what had happened. But these solved cases represented only a portion of the corridor's history. They did not close the story. They defined its limits. Where convictions occurred, they were often tied to specific victims whose remains were recovered and identified within a time frame that allowed forensic linkage. Evidence survived long enough to be tested. Witness testimony, however limited, could still be corroborated. In some cases, offenders were already under scrutiny for other crimes, allowing investigators to draw connections retroactively. These resolutions brought a measure of accountability, but they also revealed how narrow the window for justice can be. The difference between a solved case and an unsolved one was often not the severity of the crime, but timing. When evidence was preserved, when records were accurate, when jurisdictional cooperation happened early enough, answers became possible. In contrast, many disappearances along the corridor remain unresolved to this day. No remains were found. No suspect was conclusively identified. No evidence survived long enough to support prosecution. These cases occupy a different category, not because they matter less, but because the system lacks the means to resolve them definitively. For some victims, remains were recovered, but identification proved impossible for decades. In a few instances, identification eventually occurred through modern forensic methods, but by then, potential perpetrators were dead or beyond prosecution. Legal resolution was no longer an option. The truth, once discovered, could not be acted upon in court. Other cases never reached even that point. The individuals vanished, and no trace was ever recovered. Their cases exist as reports, descriptions, and last known sightings. They remain open in principle, but dormant in practice. Without new evidence, they cannot move forward. The coexistence of solved and unsolved cases along the same corridor highlights a critical reality. Resolution is not distributed evenly. It depends on factors largely outside the control of victims or families: geography, timing, record-keeping, and chance. Two disappearances separated by miles or months could face entirely different outcomes. The presence of multiple offenders further complicates the picture. Some perpetrators were identified and convicted for specific murders, but investigators could not conclusively link them to other disappearances in the same area. Suspicion existed, but suspicion is not proof. Without definitive evidence, cases remained officially separate, even when patterns suggested overlap. This restraint mattered. Law enforcement resisted the temptation to assign unresolved cases to known offenders without substantiation. While this caution sometimes frustrated families, it preserved the integrity of official conclusions. It also underscored how much uncertainty remained. The unresolved cases are not static. Advances in forensic science continue to reopen possibilities. DNA profiles that once yielded nothing may become useful as databases expand. Genealogical research may identify relatives previously unknown. New information can emerge unexpectedly, but each year that passes reduces the likelihood of actionable results. The legal system imposes limits that science cannot override. Even when a likely perpetrator is identified, prosecution requires evidence that meets specific standards. If that evidence was lost, degraded, or never collected, the case cannot proceed, regardless of belief or probability. This gap between knowledge and justice is one of the corridor's most painful legacies. Families live within that gap. Some know who is responsible, but will never see accountability. Others know nothing at all. The distinction between solved and unsolved becomes less meaningful when both outcomes carry unresolved grief. Public understanding struggles with this nuance. There is a tendency to view cases as either closed or open, answered or unanswered. The reality along I-45 is more complex. Some cases are partially solved. Some are resolved in fact but not in law.
Some remain entirely unknown. Each category reflects a different kind of loss. The corridor's unresolved cases also raise difficult questions about prevention. If recognition had come earlier, if patterns had been identified sooner, how many disappearances might have been prevented? This question cannot be answered definitively. It remains hypothetical, but its presence underscores the cost of delay. What was solved along the I-45 corridor proves that violence was not invisible. It could be uncovered, documented, and prosecuted under the right conditions. What was never solved proves that those conditions were too often absent. The unresolved cases are not static. They persist in records, in memory, and in the lives of families who continue to wait. Each unresolved disappearance remains an open question, not just about what happened, but about what might have been done differently. As the story of the I-45 corridor approaches its conclusion, clarity emerges alongside uncertainty. Some truths are known, others remain out of reach. The corridor's history cannot be reduced to a list of solved crimes or unsolved mysteries. It is defined by both, by what was proven and by what resisted proof. This balance is uncomfortable, but it is honest. It reflects the reality of long-term, corridor-based violence in a system built to handle isolated incidents. It shows the limits of hindsight and the permanence of consequence. What was solved offers accountability, however incomplete. What was never solved offers obligation to remember, to continue searching where possible, and to acknowledge that absence itself is part of the truth. The road does not distinguish between these outcomes. It carries them both forward equally into the present.
Interstate 45 still looks like a road built for ordinary purposes. Cars move at familiar speeds. Exit signs pass in sequence. The corridor hums with the sound of engines and routine. To most people who travel it today, nothing marks it as different from any other major highway. And yet, beneath that surface normalcy, it carries a history that does not fade with time. The legacy of the I-45 corridor is not contained in a single event or a single conclusion. It exists in accumulation of lives interrupted, of investigations delayed, of lessons learned too late. The road did not change, but the understanding of what happened along it did. That shift in understanding is where responsibility begins. What the corridor ultimately reveals is not inevitability, but vulnerability. Violence did not occur because the highway existed. It occurred because conditions aligned: anonymity, fragmentation, delayed recognition, and silence. Those conditions are not unique to this place. They can exist anywhere systems fail to communicate, to prioritize, or to see beyond individual cases. Remembering the I-45 corridor is not about fear. It is about awareness. Fear isolates. Awareness connects. The distinction matters. Fear suggests danger is unavoidable. Awareness insists it can be recognized, mitigated, and challenged. The victims connected to this corridor were not symbols. They were individuals with lives in motion, plans interrupted, futures cut short. Their disappearance was not a moment, but a process that unfolded over years, affecting families, communities, and institutions. To reduce them to statistics would be another form of erasure. Their legacy is carried not only by those who loved them, but by the systems that must learn from their absence. Each missed opportunity along the corridor points to a decision that can be made differently elsewhere. Each delayed response highlights the importance of early action. Each unresolved case reinforces the cost of silence. The road also carries the legacy of families who refused to let absence become disappearance. Their persistence reshaped investigations, influenced policy, and kept memory alive when official attention faded. They demonstrated that accountability does not begin and end with institutions. It is sustained by those who demand it. In reflecting on the corridor, it becomes clear that the most dangerous element was not the highway itself, but what surrounded it. assumptions left unchallenged, boundaries treated as barriers, and patterns dismissed because they did not fit expectation. These are not failures of hindsight, they are warnings for the present. The legacy of I-45 asks difficult questions. How many disappearances elsewhere are still treated as isolated because they do not look familiar? How many patterns remain unseen because they are environmental rather than personal? How many lives depend on systems being willing to look beyond jurisdiction and profile? It also forces recognition of limits. Some answers will never come, some names will remain missing, some accountability will never be achieved. Accepting this reality does not mean accepting inaction. It means acknowledging the full weight of consequence. The corridor reminds us that justice delayed is not abstract. It is measured in years spent searching, in evidence lost, in families waiting. Delay changes outcomes. Silence compounds harm. Yet, the story does not end in despair. It ends in responsibility. Responsibility to remember accurately, responsibility to act early, responsibility to coordinate rather than fragment, responsibility to treat absence as urgency, not inconvenience. The I-45 corridor is no longer just a place, it is a lesson written across decades. It shows how easily violence can hide in plain sight and how difficult it is to uncover once time has passed. It also shows that awareness, once gained, cannot be undone. As traffic continues to move along this road, the past moves with it, not as a warning sign, but as a reminder. Roads do not forget, landscapes remember. Whether people choose to listen determines whether history repeats itself. The legacy of I-45 is not contained in solved cases or unsolved ones alone. It exists in the space between them, where effort met limitation, where truth met delay, where silence met resistance. Remembering these victims is not about reopening wounds, it is about preventing new ones. It is about ensuring that the conditions which allowed disappearance to become routine are recognized and dismantled wherever they appear. The road still carries their names, whether spoken or unknown. It carries the weight of what happened and the obligation of what must not happen again. And that obligation belongs to everyone who hears this story. Share this story. Remember their names. Because silence is what allowed the I-45 corridor to become a grave, and silence must never win again.